We're joined by the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Mr. Speaker, thank you for joining us this morning. The Democratic proposal is designed to prevent millions of Americans from losing their health insurance, losing Medicaid coverage, or paying higher health care premiums. Why are you against that?
That's an absurd statement, what you said there. Let's be clear about what happened last night, George. No, George, let me tell you what happened last night. Everybody can go and review the facts for themselves. 44 Senate Democrats voted to reject a clean, nonpartisan continuing funding resolution to keep the United States government open.
The Democratic bill does not make them eligible.
It does, actually, because what it does is it unwinds the changes that Republicans put into the big, beautiful bill, the big signature legislation that we passed and signed into law on July 4th. That has been very successful.
Okay, so we just witnessed something that almost never happens in American politics. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court just publicly called out the Speaker of the House. Yeah, you heard that right. The head of the judicial branch just took a direct shot at one of the most powerful people in Congress. And it happened because Mike Johnson crossed a line that nobody in a position of power should ever cross. He threatened to eliminate entire federal courts because he didn't like their rulings. Are you kidding me? This is the kind of thing you'd expect to hear in an authoritarian regime, not in the United States of America. But here we are, the Speaker of the House standing at a press conference on March 25, 2025, saying, quote, "We can eliminate an entire district court just like that," casually threatening to destroy part of the federal judiciary because judges had the audacity to do their jobs and block some of Trump's executive actions. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
How long are they going to allow Chuck Schumer to do this to them so that he himself can get political cover from the far left corner of his base? He believes he's going to get a challenge for the Senate from AOC. That's what changed his mind. That's what's driving this agenda. And it's harming real American people. You said at the outset how many people will be unpaid. Well, you can take his quotes out of context, which you often do, and I don't think that's fair to the president. I'll tell you what he's done, though. He's put National Guard troops here in D.C. and cleaned up the crime problem. People can walk safely to and from work today because the president takes crime seriously.
Come on, this is wild. And what makes it even more significant is that the Chief Justice didn't stay silent, didn't let it slide, didn't just ignore the threat and hope it would go away. Instead, the Chief Justice issued a rare public statement directly rebuking Johnson, defending the independence of the courts, warning that political retaliation against judges constitutes, and this is a direct quote, an act of outlaw tyranny, not constitutional government. Think about those words for a second. Outlaw tyranny. The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court just accused the Speaker of the House of promoting tyranny. That's not normal political disagreement. That's not partisan bickering. That's a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. And we need to talk about why this is happening, what it means, and where this dangerous path leads if we don't stop it. Here's the context. Federal judges across the country have been issuing injunctions blocking various Trump administration policies, immigration enforcement actions, environmental rollbacks, changes to healthcare programs, the usual stuff that happens when a president pushes aggressive executive actions and courts step in to review whether those actions are legal. This is how the system is supposed to work. The executive branch takes action. Someone challenges that action in court. Judges review it. If it violates the law or the Constitution, judges block it temporarily while the case proceeds. That's checks and balances. That's separation of powers. That's basic civics. But Mike Johnson and the Republican Party don't see it that way. They see judges blocking Trump's agenda as political warfare, as activist judges trying to undermine the president, as unelected bureaucrats in robes overstepping their authority. So Johnson decided to threaten them, to say, if you keep blocking what we want to do, we'll just eliminate your courts entirely. And he wasn't joking. He explicitly said Congress has authority over the federal courts and can use that authority to get rid of district courts that issue rulings Republicans don't like. That's not a constitutional argument. That's mob boss logic. That's saying, nice court system you got there, would be a shame if something happened to it. The Chief Justice saw this threat for what it was, an attack on judicial independence, an attempt to intimidate judges into ruling the way Republicans want them to rule. And the Chief Justice responded forcefully. The statement made it clear that while impeachment is an appropriate response if a judge actually does something wrong, threatening an entire court for doing its job is outrageous and a direct attack on the rule of law. That's huge. Because Supreme Court justices almost never make public statements like this. They almost never wade into political controversies. They almost never directly criticize members of Congress. The tradition is to stay above the fray, to let their written opinions speak for themselves, to maintain the appearance of being removed from political battles. But this threat was so extreme, so dangerous to the entire constitutional system, that the Chief Justice felt compelled to speak out, and legal organizations immediately backed up that rebuke. The American Bar Association condemned Johnson's remarks. Leading Democrats in both the House and Senate called it outrageous. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said it's outrageous to even consider defunding the courts, because that's what Johnson was threatening. Not just eliminating courts, but potentially defunding the judiciary, cutting off the money that keeps the court system running, using Congress's power of the purse as a weapon against judicial independence. This is a constitutional crisis, not a potential crisis, not a crisis that might happen someday, a crisis that's happening right now. The Speaker of the House is openly threatening to destroy parts of the federal judiciary because he doesn't like their rulings, and the Chief Justice had to publicly defend the court's right to exist and function independently. Think about how insane that is. We're not talking about some minor procedural dispute. We're talking about one branch of government threatening to eliminate another branch for doing its constitutional duty. That's the kind of thing that happens when democracies collapse, when authoritarian leaders consolidate power, when checks and balances fail, and it's happening here, right now, in America, with one of the most powerful Republicans in the country leading the charge. This story matters because it exposes just how far the Republican Party is willing to go to consolidate power. They're not just pushing policy. They're not just pursuing their political agenda. They're actively trying to dismantle the institutions that limit their power, the courts, the independent judiciary, the entire concept of separation of powers. And when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has to issue a public statement defending the court's right to exist, you know we've crossed into dangerous territory. This is a turning point, and we need to understand exactly what's at stake here. All right, so let's dig into the details of what Johnson actually said and why it's so dangerous, because the full context makes this even worse than the headline suggests. On March 25th, 2025, Mike Johnson held a press conference. Republicans had just lost another court battle. Another federal judge had issued another nationwide injunction blocking another Trump administration policy. And Johnson was furious. He didn't just express disappointment. He didn't just say they'd appeal the ruling. He went nuclear. He started talking about Congress's power over the federal courts, about how the legislative branch created the judiciary and therefore can reshape it however Congress wants, about how if judges keep blocking the Republican agenda, Congress might just eliminate entire district courts. And he said this with a straight face, like it was a perfectly reasonable response to losing court cases. Let's be clear about what he's proposing here. The federal district courts are the foundation of the American legal system. They're where almost every federal case starts, where citizens file lawsuits, where criminal cases are tried, where constitutional challenges are heard. Eliminating a district court wouldn't just affect cases involving Trump's policies. It would affect every case in that jurisdiction, every criminal prosecution, every civil lawsuit, every constitutional claim. Thousands of cases would be thrown into chaos. Justice would be denied to countless people who have nothing to do with politics. The entire legal system in that region would collapse. And Johnson's proposing this as retaliation for judges doing their jobs, as punishment for judicial independence, as a warning to other judges that if they rule against Republican interests, their courts might be next. This is authoritarianism, pure and simple. Now, Johnson and his defenders will argue that Congress technically does have constitutional authority over the federal courts. And that's true, to a point. Article 3 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to create lower federal courts. The Supreme Court is the only court that the Constitution directly establishes. Everything below that, the circuit courts, the district courts, all of that was created by Congress through legislation. And what Congress creates, Congress can theoretically eliminate. But here's the thing, just because you technically have the power to do something, doesn't mean it's constitutional to actually do it. Just because Congress can eliminate courts, doesn't mean Congress can eliminate courts as retaliation for rulings they don't like. That crosses the line from legitimate legislative authority into attacking judicial independence. And judicial independence is a fundamental principle of the Constitution. It's why federal judges have lifetime appointments. It's why their salaries can't be reduced while they're in office. It's why they're supposed to be insulated from political pressure. The whole point is that judges should be able to rule based on law and constitution without fear of retaliation, without worrying that if they make an unpopular decision, politicians will destroy their careers or eliminate their courts. That's what allows the judiciary to serve as a check on the other branches, to strike down unconstitutional laws, to block illegal executive actions, to protect individual rights, even when it's politically unpopular. If judges have to worry that ruling against the government will result in their courts being eliminated, then judicial independence is dead. Then judges become political actors, ruling based on what's safe rather than what's right. Then the entire separation of powers collapses. That's why the Chief Justice responded so strongly, because Johnson's threat attacks the foundation of constitutional government. It says that judges who don't rule the way Republicans want will face consequences, that the courts exist at the pleasure of the political branches and can be eliminated whenever they become inconvenient. The Chief Justice's statement made this crystal clear. Impeachment is the appropriate remedy if a judge actually does something wrong, if they're corrupt, if they're incompetent, if they violate their oath of office. There's a constitutional process for removing bad judges, but threatening to eliminate entire courts because you disagree with their rulings, that's not constitutional accountability, that's tyranny. That's saying judges should rule based on political pressure rather than legal principles, and the Chief Justice wasn't going to let that stand without pushback. Now let's talk about why this is happening now, why Johnson felt emboldened to make these threats, why Republicans are escalating attacks on the judiciary to this degree. It's because the courts have been one of the few institutions still pushing back against Trump's agenda. Congress is controlled by Republicans who mostly do whatever Trump wants. The executive branch is obviously controlled by Trump. But the courts, even with conservative judges appointed by Trump himself, have been issuing rulings that block some of his more extreme policies. Not every ruling, not even most rulings, but enough to frustrate the administration and congressional Republicans. And rather than accepting that this is how checks and balances work, rather than modifying their policies to comply with the law, Republicans have decided to attack the courts themselves, to delegitimize judicial review, to threaten judges who rule against them. We've seen this playbook before. Trump attacked judges throughout his first term, called them biased, questioned their authority, encouraged his supporters to view unfavorable rulings as illegitimate. But Johnson's threat takes it to a new level because he's not just one politician complaining about judges. He's the Speaker of the House. He's one of the most powerful people in government, and he's threatening to use congressional power to destroy courts as retaliation for rulings he doesn't like. That's an escalation that crosses into constitutional crisis territory. And here's what makes it even more dangerous. Johnson isn't operating in isolation. He's coordinating with the Trump administration. We've seen evidence of this in other contexts. The midnight calls between Trump and Attorney General Pam Bondi, the political prosecutions. What's the use of federal power to target Trump's enemies? There's a pattern here of the executive and legislative branches coordinating to consolidate power and eliminate checks on that power. The courts are one of the last institutions standing in the way, so of course they're being targeted. Of course, Republicans are threatening to eliminate them because an independent judiciary is incompatible with authoritarian rule. You can't have both. Either courts can check executive and legislative power, or they can't. Either judges can rule based on law without fear of retaliation, or they can't. There's no middle ground here, and Johnson's threat makes it clear which side he's on. Now, the immediate response to Johnson's comments was swift and strong. Democrats immediately condemned it. Chuck Schumer called it outrageous. Leading House Democrats said it was a direct attack on the rule of law. Legal organizations issue statements defending judicial independence. And of course, the Chief Justice's public rebuke. But here's the question. Will any of that actually stop Johnson and Republicans from following through? Will political pressure and public criticism be enough to prevent them from trying to eliminate courts? Or are we just watching the early stages of a successful authoritarian takeover? Because that's what this is. When one branch of government threatens to eliminate another branch for doing its constitutional duty, that's authoritarianism. That's tyranny. That's the end of checks and balances. And the scary thing is that Republicans might actually have the votes to do this. They control the House. They control the Senate. If they stay unified, they could pass legislation eliminating district courts. Trump would obviously sign it. And then what? Would the Supreme Court strike it down as unconstitutional? Maybe, but maybe not. The Supreme Court has been reluctant to intervene in disputes between the political branches. They might decide this is a political question that courts shouldn't touch. And even if they did strike it down, even if the Supreme Court ruled that eliminating courts as retaliation is unconstitutional, would Republicans respect that ruling? Or would they attack the Supreme Court next, threaten to pack it with more justices, threaten to impeach justices who ruled against them? We're in uncharted territory here. We're watching a political party test the limits of constitutional government, seeing how far they can push before something breaks. And the Chief Justice's public statement suggests that we're approaching that breaking point, that the judicial branch is drawing a line and saying this far, no further. But words only matter if there are consequences for crossing the line. If Republicans go ahead with Johnson's threat despite the Chief Justice's rebuke, then what? The Chief Justice can't enforce judicial independence alone. The courts can't defend themselves. They depend on the political branches respecting constitutional norms and boundaries. And if those norms and boundaries are being deliberately violated, if Republicans have decided that consolidating power is more important than preserving constitutional government, then public statements aren't going to stop them. That's the terrifying reality we're facing. The Chief Justice issued a powerful rebuke, but it's just words on paper unless there's political will to back it up. Unless enough Republicans decide that preserving judicial independence is more important than partisan loyalty, unless the American people demand accountability loudly enough to create political consequences. Right now, we're in a moment of uncertainty. The threat has been made, the rebuke has been issued, and we're waiting to see what happens next. Does Johnson back down? Does he double down? Do Republicans actually try to eliminate courts? Does the situation escalate further? We don't know yet, but what we do know is that this is a constitutional crisis, a direct conflict between branches of government over fundamental questions of power and authority, a test of whether American democracy can survive extreme partisan warfare, and the outcome of this conflict will shape the country for generations. Because once you eliminate judicial independence, once you establish that courts exist at the pleasure of politicians, you can't easily get that back. Once that precedent is set, once that line is crossed, the damage is permanent. Okay? So let's break down what this all means and why everyone should be paying very close attention right now. Point 1. Mike Johnson's threat to eliminate federal courts is unprecedented and represents a direct attack on the separation of powers. We've had politicians complain about court rulings before. We've had presidents criticize judges. We've had congressional hearings where lawmakers grill judicial nominees. But we've never had the Speaker of the House openly threaten to eliminate entire courts as retaliation for rulings he doesn't like. That's a line that nobody in power should ever cross, because the whole point of having 3 separate branches of government is that they check each other. Congress makes laws, the executive enforces laws. The courts interpret laws and strike down actions that violate the Constitution. That system only works if each branch can operate independently without fear that the other branches will destroy them for doing their jobs. Johnson's threat destroys that independence. It tells judges that if they rule against Republican interests, their courts might be eliminated. That creates impossible pressure on judges. They're supposed to rule based on law and Constitution, but if ruling honestly means their court gets eliminated and all their colleagues lose their jobs and thousands of cases get thrown into chaos, what are they supposed to do? That's not a system of justice. That's a system of intimidation. That's judges ruling based on threats rather than law. And once you have that, you don't have an independent judiciary anymore. You have a rubber stamp, a branch that exists to legitimize whatever the political branches want to do. Point 2. The Chief Justice's public rebuke is historically significant and shows just how serious this crisis has become. Supreme Court justices almost never make public political statements. They maintain distance from partisan fights. They let their written opinions do the talking. The whole culture of the Supreme Court is built around appearing above politics, seeming neutral and impartial, even when dealing with controversial cases. So when the Chief Justice breaks that tradition and issues a direct public rebuke of the Speaker of the House, that tells you how dangerous the situation has become. The Chief Justice clearly felt that staying silent would be worse than speaking out, that allowing Johnson's threat to go unanswered would itself damage judicial independence, that sometimes defending the courts requires stepping into the political arena, even though that's uncomfortable and breaks with tradition. And the language the Chief Justice used was strong, calling Johnson's threat an act of outlaw tyranny, not constitutional government. Those aren't words you use lightly. That's the head of the judicial branch saying that the Speaker of the House is promoting tyranny, saying that threatening courts is fundamentally incompatible with constitutional democracy. That's a big deal. That's a historical moment. That's something people will be studying in law schools and political science classes for decades, because it marks a turning point, a moment when the conflict between branches became so severe that the Chief Justice felt compelled to publicly defend the court's right to exist. Point 3. This conflict exposes the broader Republican strategy of dismantling institutions that check their power. The courts aren't the only institution under attack. We've seen Trump and congressional Republicans go after the Justice Department, trying to turn it into a political weapon. We've seen attacks on the FBI, on intelligence agencies, on regulatory bodies, on the media, on any institution that has the power to investigate, criticize, or constrain Republican actions. There's a clear pattern here. Republicans have decided that winning power isn't enough. They want to eliminate checks on that power. They want to create a system where the executive and legislative branches, when controlled by Republicans, can do whatever they want without meaningful opposition. And that requires attacking independent institutions, delegitimizing them, threatening them, eventually eliminating them if necessary. Johnson's threat against the courts fits perfectly into that pattern. It's another step in the systematic dismantling of democratic checks and balances. Point 4. The American people need to understand what's at stake and demand accountability before it's too late. Because here's the thing, a lot of people don't pay close attention to institutional conflicts like this. They don't follow separation of powers disputes. They don't get worked up about threats to judicial independence. It seems abstract, theoretical, like inside baseball for political nerds. But this isn't abstract. This affects everyone. Because once you lose an independent judiciary, once courts become political actors ruling based on what politicians want rather than what the law requires, then nobody's rights are safe. The rights you care about, whatever they are, They only exist because courts are willing to enforce them even when it's politically unpopular. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, due process, equal protection, property rights. All of it depends on having courts that will stand up to the government when the government violates those rights. If courts can be eliminated for ruling against the government, then those rights become meaningless. They're just words on paper that nobody will enforce. So this isn't just a political fight. This is about whether America remains a country where rights matter and laws constrain power, or becomes a country where might makes right and whoever controls the political branches can do whatever they want. Those are the stakes. And the American people need to make their voices heard, need to tell their representatives that threatening to eliminate courts is unacceptable, that judicial independence is non-negotiable, that constitutional government matters more than partisan advantage. Because if there's no political price for Johnson's threat, if Republicans face no consequences for attacking the judiciary, then they'll keep doing it. They'll escalate further. They'll actually start eliminating courts. And by the time people realize what's been lost, it'll be too late to get it back. So what happens next? Well, we're in a waiting period right now. Johnson made his threat. The Chief Justice issued a rebuke. Legal organizations and Democrats condemned it. And now we're watching to see if Johnson backs down or doubles down. Does he apologize and walk it back? Does he clarify that he didn't mean it literally? Or does he stand by the threat and start actually pursuing legislation to eliminate courts? We don't know yet, but either way, the damage is already done to some extent. Because even if Johnson backs down, the threat has been made. Judges now know that if they rule against Republican interests, congressional leadership might try to eliminate their courts. That threat will influence judicial behavior, even if it's never carried out. That's how intimidation works. You don't have to actually follow through on every threat. Just making the threat changes behavior, creates fear, undermines independence. So the Chief Justice was right to respond publicly and forcefully, to make clear that such threats are illegitimate and tyrannical, to try to rally public support for judicial independence before it's too late. But public statements aren't enough. There need to be real consequences. Johnson needs to face political backlash, severe enough that he and other Republicans think twice before attacking the judiciary again. And that backlash needs to come not just from Democrats and legal organizations, but from ordinary Americans who understand what's at stake, from voters who care about constitutional government, from people across the political spectrum who recognize that an independent judiciary protects everyone, not just one party. Because here's the truth. Today, Republicans are threatening courts that rule against Trump, but tomorrow it could be Democrats threatening courts that rule against their president. Once this precedent is set, once it becomes acceptable to attack judicial independence, both parties will do it. The damage will compound, the institution will crumble, and we'll all lose. So this isn't a partisan issue. This is about preserving the basic structure of American constitutional government, about maintaining the separation of powers that has protected American democracy for over 2 centuries, about ensuring that courts can serve as an independent check on government power, regardless of which party is in charge. The Chief Justice understands this. That's why the rebuke was so strong. That's why it was important to speak out despite the tradition of staying above political fights. Because sometimes defending constitutional principles requires taking a stand, requires saying clearly and publicly that certain actions are beyond the pale, are incompatible with constitutional government, are tyrannical, and must be opposed. That's what we just witnessed, a historic moment. The Chief Justice of the United States calling out the Speaker of the House for promoting tyranny, defending the independence of the federal judiciary, drawing a line and saying this far, no further. Now it's up to the rest of us to support that stand, to make clear that we won't accept threats against judicial independence, that constitutional government matters, that checks and balances are worth preserving, even when they're inconvenient. Because if we don't, if we stay silent, if we let this moment pass without consequences, then Johnson's threat becomes normalized, becomes acceptable, becomes the new baseline for how politicians treat courts they disagree with. And once that happens, we've lost something fundamental, something that made America different, something worth fighting to preserve. So pay attention, speak up, demand accountability, because this is one of those moments where the future of American democracy hangs in the balance, where the choices we make now will determine what kind of country we become. And the Chief Justice just showed us what leadership looks like in such a moment. Now it's our turn.